We're so glad you joined us at the right time because we have author Rich Shmelter coming on to talk about his latest book on the championship team of 1964. It's the Cleveland Browns. Rich Shmelter's here to tell us all about this and his Dynasty series coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darin Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darin Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And it is time to go into another author's book. And we have a great one on pro football history. Rich Shmelter is our friend that has come on quite a bit on our show and talked about a lot of different things, mostly from the California area. But he's got an interesting book that's non-Californian. I'll let him introduce it in a second. Rich, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Darin, thank you so much. I cannot wait to get back in that pig pen. I missed it so much. I want to get all nice and dirty.
Well, we're
That didn't sound good. That didn't come out good. You know what I meant.
Yeah. There's no dirty talk here, Rich. Come on now.
That's right. That didn't come out right.
But we are going to get
Wrong
down
podcast.
we're going to get down and dirty in some pro football history today. You have a book that just came out that's catching everybody by storm, and I see it all over social media. People are excited about this. And why don't you tell us the title of the book and where folks can get it to start off with?
It's part of my Championship Diary series, and it's called Drive to Conquest. And it's the story of the 1964 Cleveland Browns, which celebrates the 60th anniversary of their NFL championship. This was an NFL championship 2 years prior to the Super Bowl. They actually did play championship games before the Super Bowl. So, and the Browns were one of the last ones to win the championship before the Super Bowl.
Well, that is cool. And that's the Browns' last NFL title, correct? To date?
Yes.
Okay. As we're recording this at the end of 2024, and I don't know if they're going to make one this year, but
No, I don't think so, unfortunately. But you always have that championship and some of the other ones to keep people warm.
right. So, what made this this season and this particular Cleveland Browns team interesting to you to want to write a book on?
This goes back to when I was in junior high. I remember for Christmas I got a punt pass and kick, the old punt pass and kick library,
Mm-hmm.
and it was called Championship Teams of the NFL. My folks got it for me for Christmas. So I took it to junior high, and every day in study hall I read one of the stories, and there were 5 of them in there. The last one was the 64 Browns. And again, I was, in the I was in the Super Bowl era, and I at that time, and I couldn't understand what that was all about. Like, how could the Browns win a championship when they were never to the Super Bowl? Well, then it all made sense. I started to fall in love with that team and started to talk to, some relatives that were there and everything. So that love affair started then. And then around in the later 80s, early 90s, I told my wife, I really would like to try to write a book. And I was encouraged by some good friends of mine and my wife also. So I put this project together, and it was a labor of love, but it was kind of not as professional as you would want it to be. So then I got involved in other projects, and that kind of got put on the back burner. It was still on a floppy disk. And back in, I believe it was February, I told my wife, I said, you know what? I have that book. It's going to be 60 years. So we got a device that could transfer it from a floppy disk onto the Apple. I got it. I put it onto the Apple, and the manuscript came up. Well, I had to shine it up a little bit, and I dissected it quite a bit. I basically rewrote it, and it came out to be a really interesting book. I don't mean to be arrogant about it, but I was looking at it, and I even told my wife and friends, I said, this is really pretty good. It really came out good. And I just had a wonderful time doing it, and I've always loved that team. That team is one of my all-time favorite teams of any team in NFL history. Just fantastic. They came out of nowhere, and to me, I believe it was the greatest upset in NFL history pre-Super Bowl. Now, you're going to have people say 1968 New York Jets, and that's understandable. They beat the Colts. Also, the Browns beat the Colts in 64 for the championship, but not only did they beat them, but they shut them out and they annihilated them, and they weren't supposed to win. So,
well, why don't you give us a little bit of background about how their season went, why you say that, why it's such a miracle. Give us a little bit of background how they did that year.
They were called the Laugh Champs, even though they wound up going 10-3-1. And they were slow at many positions. Their pass defense was ranked last in the NFL. Minus with the exception of Jim Brown, the offense, you had Paul Warfield and Jim Brown. You also had Gary Collins, that was a phenomenal receiver, a Pennsylvania guy. I'm sure you know
Mhm.
that. And Frank Ryan at quarterback, who was a steady game manager, but he didn't stand out like a Johnny Unitas did. Of course, not too many people did. And they went through the season, and when they won the Eastern Conference at that time, there was the Eastern Conference and the Western Conference dividing up into the NFL. And when they won it, they won it on the last week of the season, and people were saying, "Oh, they're the laugh champs. Their only honor is to go into the championship game and get annihilated by the Baltimore Colts."
Who did they play in the Eastern Conference Championship game or the
Oh,
EFC?
there was no championship at that. It was just, you know,
They just
basically.
had the two best teams, the best of the East versus the best of the West.
Right,
Okay,
exactly. There
okay,
was no playoff at that time. Those
okay.
playoffs started a few years later when the Super Bowl era started. That's when they had the playoffs for the Eastern Conference Championship and all. And then you met the champion of the West to go to the Super Bowl. So there were two playoff games at that time. But with this game, unless the conference ended in a tie, then you were the champion of that. So they went into the championship game. Now, at that time, the Baltimore Colts were 12-2. They were a wrecking machine. The Browns were 10-3-1. However, the Browns got to host the championship game because it was on an alternating basis for the hosting. So it just so happened that it fell on the Eastern Conference. Whoever was going to win the Eastern Conference was going to host the national NFL championship game. So wound up being in Cleveland, and the Colts came here, and it was just, the Baltimore Colts, they were the number one ranked offense. They had an incredible team with Lenny Moore. He was the comeback player of the year, scored 20 touchdowns. Johnny Unitas, Raymond Berry. I mean, this team was just loaded, just loaded. And the Cleveland Browns had a slow secondary. They didn't, they weren't respected as far as the defensive line. And again, the only person that had any respect was Jim Brown. And yet they went in there and they had an incredible a game plan that set up things. They always said head coach Blanton Collier, and it's like you give this guy a pint of ice cream, pint of vanilla ice cream, and a projector, and he will dissect anything and turn it into an incredible game plan. And along with Bernie Parrish, the one defensive back, and Walter Beach, the other defensive back, they started to watch these films, and they said, if we give a little bit of a bump to these receivers, because Johnny Unitas had timing, he would go back 7 steps, boom, fire a pass, and that receiver had to be right where that was. That was pure timing, and they just knew each other so well. They disrupted it, and they said the Cleveland Browns had a charging line as opposed to a reactionary line. They just charged right in there. So they said if they could apply pressure on Unitas, and the linebackers could drop back and plug up those holes, and those defensive backs could just do that little nudge and throw them off, they had a chance. And darn if they didn't. They shut him out. Johnny Unitas had the worst day of his professional career. Only threw for 95 yards, which usually he could have
Wow.
for that in 1 quarter. And
Right.
they
Yeah.
and the Browns just let loose. And Gary Collins caught 3 touchdown passes. Jim Brown ran for over 100 yards, and he wound up saying at the end that was the greatest thrill of his life.
Hmm. Just to go back on to clarify to the listeners. So back in '64, when they had the East and the West, 14 teams in the NFL was before the merger, like you said. Well, the Baltimore Colts were in Baltimore, but they were in the Western Division with the Packers and the Vikings and the Lions and the Rams, Bears, and the 49ers. So they were really they were an East Coast team in the West, where you had the Chicago Cardinals at the time. I believe they were still in Chicago at that time.
Oh, St. Louis. That was St.
Or were
Louis
they St.
Cardinals
Louis? Okay.
at that
So,
time.
but you had Dallas in the East and St.
St. Louis.
Louis in the East,
Yeah.
in the East. So it's
That's,
kind of weird. So the NFL is just as screwed up back then as it was now
that
of
is
knowing
now.
where they had teams at. So it's
Yes.
so okay. So yeah, you had some amazing players, and I believe wasn't that the year Jim Brown had an amazing season that year too, didn't he? Have
Jim, that was the
64?
1963 season. He ran for 1,863 yards, set the all-time, at that time, single season NFL rushing record for that. He won the Player of the Year that year, most valuable player. In 64, he ran for, I believe it was 1,466 yards. And so he had a solid year. I mean, Jim Brown had a solid year every year he
Yeah,
played.
14 game season. That's pretty good.
Oh
1400
yeah.
over 100 yards a game.
Oh yeah.
That's
He was
outstanding.
he was just dominant. absolutely dominant. And he had a he had a great championship game. And if Gary Collins didn't catch three touchdown passes, Jim Brown probably would have been the MVP of that game.
Hmm. Wow. So this resonated to you. How many years later, when you were reading that punt, pass, and kick, was this? I know you're in your late 20s now, so I'm
I'm
trying
in my
to.
late 20s,
Yeah,
yes.
so
I'm
so
I didn't graduate in the
I,
late 20s in case no, I'm in my late 20s. It's a lot of people say I'm the oldest 21-year-old they know. So I'm just going with that. I'm just gonna
but I
but
mean, so you were. I mean, this is like a
I was
decade
about
after.
I was about 13, and then I decided to I was 13 in junior high, and then I decided to write it. I was always interested in reading different things and everything. And I said, you know what? I want to try it. I want to take a shot at writing something. And I said, you know what? At that time, I only had access to the Cleveland newspapers and all. So I said, I love the 64 Browns championship team. So I went down to the library, got all the information I could out of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Cleveland Press, and every single article I could find on this. And I had it all put together in a nice little scrapbook. And then I decided to write. And I wrote the book out. And like I said, I sent it to a couple publishers in the early 90s and all. And that was before you could publish things yourself. And it was a different business at that time. And it got rejected. And I got a little, like, oh geez, I mean, you don't expect, you just expect this grand entrance. They were just going to come and hoist you up on their shoulders and be so happy that you saved their company. And that didn't happen. So I decided to shift gears and went on to other things. But then as time went on, I always kind of had that in the back of my mind. And every other project that I did, I said, that book is still looming around somewhere. And I kept looking at that floppy disk. And then finally this year, I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And like I said, I cleaned it up, and so it really came out great. It really, yeah, I'm very, very pleased with it, and it's an honor to see that finally come out like that. Um, it was something that if I could have looked back, if I could go back into the past and look at how it was going to turn out, I wouldn't have believed it. Where you have such access to do so much more now in the publishing field, and it was just incredible to see it made into a book and being well received. So I appreciate the kind words that you said earlier about that.
Uh, I think I guess what I was trying to get at though, Rich, is that when you said that you read about this Cleveland team, this isn't like 2 years after it happened. This is more like a decade after they won the championship, right?
Oh yeah, I was 13 when I read the book, and the Browns were already that was, let me see, 64. It was about 9 or 10 years after the Browns won
Okay.
the championship that I read the book. Is that what you were going
Okay.
for?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
yeah.
that's what I go for. That's okay.
I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
And then
You've got some
then
interesting stuff in there. And I think, one of the things I think that's maybe we don't realize, because this is like almost a decade, I think, after the Browns' three previous NFL championships. And of course, their AAFC titles before that. But this is the second year that Collier is their coach. Paul Brown's, he's unseated, by ownership a year before that. So Collier he's in his second year and takes this Browns team to the championship game and they win it. I mean, I think it's another amazing thing. It's not, there's some stragglers players from the Paul Brown era, but this is a blatant Collier's team at that point.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Paul Brown was naturally a fantastic coach, but he got stagnant and he didn't want to change ways. The NFL was changing a little bit. He didn't want to change. Other teams were catching up to him, and a lot of teams were taking his assistant coaches to coach their teams, and they were becoming successful. A lot like you saw people like, let's say, from the Bill Belichick coaching tree. Now, maybe those players didn't become as successful as Belichick, but let's say Bill Parcells. He had some people that won Super Bowls. Bill Belichick, one of them. But people were, he had Weeb Ewbank as a coach, and Weeb Ewbank got very successful with the Colts and then later with the Jets. So he had quite a few people that were going off, and he just refused to change. And his old coaches were expanding their horizons, and he just thought his way was the only way. And all the other previous ownership, they didn't want nothing, they minded their own business. Paul Brown's word was it. So then here comes Art Modell as the owner when he bought the team, and I believe it was 61. And all of a sudden he wanted to ask questions. Well, why is this? Why is this? And Paul Brown was very stoic to him, didn't really want to deal well with him. He didn't like having this man meddle in his business. And he refused to change. Jim Brown voiced his opinion. And it's not that Jim Brown didn't get along with Paul Brown, but the relationship was strained. And it probably would have come to he wanted to get out of Cleveland. And you're not, if it came down to Paul Brown or Jim Brown at that time, Paul Brown was going to go. And Art Modell did something that was probably the second worst thing that he did to the city of Cleveland, beside moving the team in 95. He got rid of Paul Brown. So, you get rid of this legend and you bring in this Blanton Collier gentleman, and who was also an assistant under Paul Brown for years. And all of a sudden this man turns around, and he was more of a listener. If a player would come up to Paul Brown and say this and that, he didn't want to hear it. It was, he wanted to go A, B, C. He didn't want to go from A to Z. And he didn't care about anything in between. Where Blanton Collier was different like that. If Jim Brown said something, or Frank Ryan, he listened to him. Of course, Frank Ryan was a PhD. He was a doctor of mathematics, so you kind of wanted to listen to him a little bit. And so Blanton Collier was willing to listen. He was an incredible game planner and all. And he was just a kind gentleman. He used to always say, shake my left hand, it's closest to my heart. He just had that Kentucky gentleman aspect about him. And the players just, flocked to him like that. And it just all clicked. It all clicked a year after he took over as coach. And like I said, it's just an incredible story. Just an incredible story.
So who were okay? We know that the Colts were their ultimate opponent in the championship game. Who were some of the rivalries that they had that year, during the regular season? Like some
The,
tight games.
the St. Louis Cardinals, now the Arizona Cardinals, they were the team. Actually, the St. Louis Cardinals were supposed to win that division. Cleveland was supposed to finish in third place. And that's what made it, again, so amazing. Third place at best, you know. And St. Louis was supposed to win that division. I'm sorry, that conference. And then you had the New York Giants, who won many champions. They were division champions for years, from 1956 to 1963. They just rode a crest of winning championship, winning at least conference championships. They won one NFL championship, but they just couldn't get past the Colts or the Packers in a couple of the championship games, and of course the Bears in '63. And then age caught up with them, but they were still a fierce rival of Cleveland. But it wasn't there anymore. I mean, they only won 2 games that year, so the Giants were kind of out. But I would say St. Louis was, and Dallas was coming up on the rise, and Dallas gave them a tough time, a real tough scare in one of the games. But it was St. Louis that they fought to a 33-33 tie in week 2. And then just as the Browns were ready to clinch the Eastern Conference title, they went down to St. Louis. It was a muddy game, and they had champagne waiting in the locker room, and the champagne didn't get popped because St. Louis beat them. So St. Louis almost snuck in there. If the Browns did not win against the Giants, then St. Louis would have gone to the championship game. But they annihilated the Giants in the season finale. Just annihilated them. I believe it was 52-20.
Yeah, that was. I'm looking at the standings. Cleveland with that 10-3-1, the Cardinals with 9-3-2. So it was a 2-horse race, because the Eagles were next, and they were like 6-8. They weren't even at 500. But in the West, the Colts were, they were top dog at 12-2. But then you have a logjam of the Packers, the Vikings, and the Lions, all with 5 losses and 7 or 8 wins. So it's
Oh
amazing.
yeah.
And these are Lombardi's Packers. That's what I was first thing I was looking at. Like, where are Lombardi's Packers at?
Oh yeah.
They're like sandwiched in between championships here in that year.
Yeah, they were. They fell after they won in 61, 62. Then 63, Paul Hornung got suspended for gambling. And then in 1964, Jerry Kramer wound up having a stomach infection from splinters that he got in his stomach when he was a kid, fell on a fence. And then age was starting to catch up with them a little bit too. So Lombardi was it's funny because I mean, he went 9-5, and um, he actually beat the Cleveland Browns that year. They beat the Browns later in the season, the regular season. And it was like, you still had Jim Taylor, who was a tough runner and everything like that. But again, he was starting to show wear and tear, and the Packers were getting a little long in the tooth. But again, another great story is the year after that, the Packers in 1965 turned it around and won the NFL championship against Cleveland. And that's a future project of mine, by the way, the 65 Packers in my championship diary series. I can't help it, man. I just love these human interest stories with these teams. Just amazing.
Well, since you're segueing into it, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the championship series is, and where you're at so far with the series, and where you plan on going? What's your utopic situation for it?
I kind of go like where the wind blows me with this. I started off with the 1983 Raiders. I did the championship. The first one was a championship diary series with the 1983 Los Angeles Raiders Super Bowl 18 win. And then I turned this 64 Browns into a championship diary. And I'm going to do one with the 65 Packers coming up. I already have the outline all set for it and all. So that hopefully that should be coming out early next year. Well, maybe March or April. I have some other things in the fire. We'll talk later. But I have some other things in the fire. But I just kind of like to look at some teams, the human interest stories, and just just some of these older teams that I like to try to bring to the forefront. And I'd like to do one maybe on the 56 Giants. Another great team. I mean, they Frank Gifford and Charlie Connerly, and they just had Sam Huff and Lombardi and Vince Lombardi and Tom Landry were assistant coaches on that team. So, it was in the big city of New York. It was, and that they always said that the 58 title game was the turning point of professional football, but 1956 kind of started it because the Giants they were the toast of the town. They could go into any restaurant. They were, young, good-looking guys, and they would just go in there and they just, women were crazy about them and all. So that was kind of like and it was in a big city like that. So that's an interesting story for me. And I just try to like cherry pick some of these teams, and I'll probably do some more Super Bowls, also some more Super Bowl teams. But I like that pre-Super Bowl. Those pre-Super Bowl stories are fascinating.
Yeah, and it's stories that most modern football fans don't know about. And you and I, well, maybe I definitely wasn't alive then, and there's a lot of people younger than me that are football fans, and we don't know about it. So all we know is what we read and what video tape is left of it.
Well, Darren, the amazing thing is that I noticed was maybe 15 to 20 years ago, when you talked about professional football history writing, a lot of people didn't gravitate toward it, and they were more gravitated toward baseball. I mean, baseball history. You could write a book about 1890 Cleveland Spiders or something, a team like that,
Mm.
and people would probably gravitate toward it because it's baseball history. And now all of a sudden, I started to notice a trend, I'd say maybe over the past 5 years, that all of a sudden professional football history is catching up like that, and more people are interested in that. You see a lot of these books coming out, such as the case with yours, the great books that you're writing. And and folks, if you didn't get Darin's first book, I mean, it's amazing. I'll let Darin share more about it, but you could almost smell the environment that he's trying to describe, and it's just incredible writing. So kudos to you, Darin.
Oh, thank
And
you. Very kind words.
my pleasure. Awesome guy. But
Mm.
I just like that. Um, I just like those stories, and I think a lot of people, especially now over in Europe, a lot of people over there are starting to really find out about the NFL over there. Professional football over there now, American professional football. And people are really interested in it over there. And now they're starting to take an interest in this more and more over there. So, if your favorite team is the Cleveland Browns or the Las Vegas Raiders or Pittsburgh Steelers, maybe you want to know a little bit about the history. And I know when I was coming up and I would read those punt, pass, and kick books, you'd see these books, and I all of a sudden got interested in the 64 Browns because of that, and some of the other teams that are listed in there, and the 51 Rams. And then I wrote that book on Professional Football Goes Hollywood, and it was geared up toward the 51 Rams. So everything stems from something, and I just think professional football history is really interesting right now, and people are trying to suck them up like sponges.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right, and I think this is a great book for people they want to take that jump and get some holiday reading in. It's a great opportunity. So, Rich, why don't we take this opportunity again to tell the name of your book and where folks can get it?
Yeah, the name of the book is Drive to Conquest, the story of the 1964 Cleveland Browns. And you just go to Amazon Books and punch in Drive to Conquest. And it'll come up. You see the nice big orange cover on it with the picture of the 1964 Browns right in the middle. And you can't miss it. It's an ebook as well as a physical copy. So
All right.
get either or.
All right. Well, Rich, we really appreciate you coming on here and sharing this history of your book and writing the book to preserve the football history. And, we're excited about your next venture and your books on your championship series, and can't wait to talk to you about that too. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Darin, so much. And Merry Christmas to everybody. Have a happy holiday. And I hope if you do get the book, I hope that you enjoy it. And thank you so much for listening. And I love coming on your show, Darin, anytime.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.